The following podcast contains adult language and themes, so don't say we didn't fucking warn you.
You're listening to SarahTalk. It's political.
You could run a fucking pet rock against Donald Trump, and I would vote for the pet rock.
Yeah.
That's where we're at right
Yeah.
Critical.
One of the things that drives me nuts as an atheist is that my polling location is at a church. And I don't necessarily have a problem. I'm not going to like burst into flames walking into a church.
Now, after being on this show and having heard your viewpoints on some things, my advice to you is don't test this. I won't burst into flames.
And positively LGBT positive.
In many states, you can still be evicted from housing simply for being gay or transgender. Stand and fight with us.
Oh, and occasionally completely absurd.
I don't know if you've ever seen a lightning bug, but he flies around with a flame of light coming out of his behind. The lightning bug got a flame coming out of his butt.
It's a beautiful night tonight. All the sodomites are out.
And now, from Orlando, Florida, your host, Sarah Austin.
Hey everybody, welcome to SarahTalk. I am Sarah Austin, your host. Surprise! We have another double episode week this week. This is episode 126. So for those of you who are regular listeners, you're going to have to weigh in here and let us know, do you like this surprise double episode week stuff? We're not going to do it every week, please. I don't have enough time, money, or energy to do this every week, but what's been happening is we've been able to line up some interviews that don't fall on the live show. So we pre-record them. I have every intention of using them in the live show, but then they end up running, 45 minutes to an hour and a half long, and that's a show in its own. And also, I don't want to bore the live audience with a pre-recorded segment that they can't ask questions and make comments and interact with. So I think this is the best bet, but if you have other ideas of if this is too much content for you all at once, let us know. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's head over to our interview this week with Chris Mosier. Joining us today is Chris Mosier, transgender athlete and creator of transathlete.com. He has quite the collection of firsts, including being the first known transgender man to make a men's U.S. national team. He's working to create more inclusive policies and is a mentor, advocate, and resource for trans athletes at all levels. Chris, welcome to SarahTalk.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you on the show. You have quite the interesting story. Why don't you take us back a bit, maybe to the early years of the Chris Mosier story?
I grew up playing sports, and sports was always something that was very important to me. Through youth, it was the way that I found friends and community. It was the way that I felt most like myself, was when I was playing sports with other people. I sort of lost that through college. I stepped away from sports because I didn't want to be on a women's team. And so I was starting to have these this understanding that my gender wasn't matching up with what my peers' expectations of me was, and something was just not lining up for me. I didn't know it. I wouldn't have named it that at that time. I had a ton of other excuses, but that's really, in hindsight, the reason that I stepped away from college sports. Did a lot of intramural, mixed gender sports, anything that I could play, just to be around other people. But I really missed that feeling of community and connection, and what sports did for me in connection to my body as I was leaving college. So having missed that for many years, I got back into playing sports first as a way to sort of see what my body could do, and in some ways to modify my body a little bit. So lifting weights, made me feel more comfortable in my skin. Running, I thought, well, if I can slim down and get a little more muscular here, maybe I will feel more comfortable in this body. It was also just a way to get back into being with other people, finding that community that I miss so much. I actually started off sort of in solo sport of running for fitness and The running then became up to a marathon and ultra marathon. I thought, what's the next thing that I could do? Bought a bike, taught myself how to swim, and did my first triathlon.
Oh my gosh!
Which I won my category in my first triathlon, and that's always encouraging. So I thought, I'm a triathlete, and sort of entered the sport in that way. In 2015, that was 2009. 2010, I transitioned, started to compete against men, and in 2015, I made the men's U.S. national team for duathlon, which is run, bike, run.
Wow.
As someone who's lazy and out of shape, if I don't feel more lazy and out of shape, oh boy, I'm gonna go run after this.
I think I hit my athletic peak at like 13.
Yeah, right. Well, you're good now. You have a bionic knee.
Now I have a bionic
Now you're
knee.
ready to go.
Let's see if I can. No.
Okay, so in 2010, you decide to transition. How did that interplay with? Were you still just doing like the solo sport at that point, or did you encounter any challenges with your athletics as you were going through that transition?
Yeah, lots of challenges, actually. So I would say that running is a pretty solo sport, but it can be a team sport, and triathlon as well. So while, I race ultimately by myself, there are situations where teams get points, and I also trained with a team. And finding a triathlon club when I was in New York City was really important to me, because that's what I wanted to get out of the sport, was that community piece. For the sports part, when I started to do well in races, both running races and triathlon before transition, as I understood my gender, this became more of an issue, because I wanted to excel in sports. I wanted to be competitive, and that's always been part of my nature, to see how well I can do. And to see the progress on the women's side put in doubt whether or not I would be able to compete on the men's side, mostly because I had never seen it done. I had never seen someone assigned female at birth transition to male and continue to play in men's sports and be competitive. So, I was missing that sort of reflection, that role model, that example to say, like, yeah, it can be done. It's sort of like the 4-minute mile. People thought that it couldn't be done, and then when it actually happened, many people have broken the 4-minute barrier in the mile since then. Mm-hmm. I think it was just one of those things of having that limitation sort of put on myself, because I wasn't sure, and it seemed like a big scary thing to take on. It came to a point in the rest of my life outside of sports where I decided, for me to be happy just navigating the world every day, I need to transition. And that if that means that I lose my ability to participate in sports, then that's going to be one of the consequences. Yeah. It was really hard to come to that decision, but I think even saying that, I wasn't really ready to let sports go. So as I transitioned, it was contacting the race organizers for running events and the running league. It's not the league, like the running group in New York City, and contacting race organizers at USA Triathlon and the races that I was doing to change my category over to the men's side. And a lot of these organizations didn't have policies at that time. In 2010, there was nothing written. There wasn't anything that I could go to online and see, here's the step-by-step process of how I do this. So it was a lot of outing myself consistently to race organizers, to people, and then having them be unsure of how to help me, and then me helping them help me. Yeah. So I feel like that's what the first 3 years was like, from 2010 to 2013, when I made transathlete.com, out as a result of my experience of trying to figure this out in sports.
Sure. Now let's talk about some of that specific policy issues. Let's look at let's start with K-12 schools. Your website provides an interesting map of the U.S., which categorizes high school policies by state and establishes by that as established by that state's high school athletic association. And we've covered some of these stories as they come up. So let's break that down a little bit more. And for now, let's just stay with the, just being allowed to play on the team, right? So the green category is identified by policies that do not require an athlete to either be on hormones or have had surgery. And there are, I believe, 18 states in that category. So that's good. The next category is yellow. And these states where policies allow for decisions to be made on a case-by-case basis, there are 17 states under that category. And I might argue that that's just as dangerous as the red category, maybe. And we'll get to that in a minute. But what are some of the harms that come out of that that case-by-case basis plan?
Well, essentially, we're saying that one person or a group of people, as established by the state high school organization, are essentially allowed to look at a person and make a determination. And a lot of times this is this harmful specifically to transgender girls because people are making assumptions based on body size.
Yep.
And this is not to say that everyone assigned male at birth is bigger, faster, stronger than someone assigned female at birth. What they're allowing for, though, is if you do have a tall trans girl who wants to play any sport, whether it's volleyball or basketball, where people think that height would be an advantage, or if it was, archery, I don't know, whatever, some high school, tennis, something like that, where people wouldn't necessarily say, oh, height is a clear, preference for a teammate. They can look at them and just say, oh, you're too tall or you're too big. And so it's really allowing for discrimination based on stereotypes and perceptions about how an athlete should look and what is quote unquote fair.
Yeah.
And so it's very dangerous to allow one person or a group of people to have the power to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis because of their ideas of quote unquote safety.
Right. And it doesn't guarantee that that whatever the group or that person comes up with is going to be applied fairly across the board, right? They may review one athlete at the beginning of the year and decide, this is the plan, and then another one pops up in a few months, and they, come up with something entirely different. So there's no there's no universal policy that I think would need to be important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that it could go the other way as well. I've actually talked to high schools that are asking me for help with a trans boy who wanted to play football or play rugby, like full contact sports, that they are, wondering what should happen in those cases where their safety is, potentially in question. And my response is always, do you stop a small cisgender boy from playing football or rugby? Or do you stop a tall cisgender girl from playing volleyball? And we don't in most cases. And so it really is dangerous for them to have the power to make those decisions.
Now, the red states are Idaho, Nebraska, and this will surprise you, Texas, Louisiana, Indiana, Alabama, North Carolina, all surprising. And these states have, these state high school athletic associations have policies that require the student to compete with the team determined by the gender marker on their birth certificate, have had gender reassignment surgeries, which is often required to change the gender marker on your birth certificate, or they institute a hormone waiting period. So they say, like, after you've been on hormones for a year or 2 years or whatever, then you can compete on the other team. Now, this is clearly discriminatory to me, and I'm sure you, Chris, and the listeners have heard us talk about before, like, why these are bad policies, but I'll ask you to say it this time. I'm tired of hearing me say it. Birth certificate, surgery, hormone waiting periods. Why doesn't this stuff work?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. Some of these states also wouldn't even allow a student to compete if they changed their birth certificate.
Oh,
so
God.
It can be as specific as original birth certificate. And so they are just really set on not allowing transgender students to compete. It's dangerous because if you require a young person to have surgery, not everyone wants to modify their body.
Right.
And not everyone has access to medical procedures that they feel comfortable with. And it's a big decision to ask a 14-year-old to make in their life, right? And we know there are a number of issues with surgeries and that not everyone wants that. So that's the first thing. Even the International Olympic Committee decided that it was a human rights violation when I challenged their policy in 2015 to get the surgery requirement removed from the IOC policy. So, if we can say that a trans person could potentially compete in the Olympics without having surgery, why would we ask a high schooler to do that just to play sports with their peers?
Right.
It doesn't make sense.
Yep. And when it comes
for the hormone
go ahead.
weight,
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
For the hormone wait time, we're asking people, young people, to take a year or potentially 2 years in some of these policies off of playing with their peers, with their friends, right? And if I think back to my high school experience of how I just wanted to participate, I just wanted to be a kid like all the other kids in my class and make those connections, find those friendships, and learn the values that people learn in the sports, like dedication and goal setting and communication and teamwork. These are all positive parts of a young person's experience in sports, and we're denying them, 1 or 2 years of that eligibility. And also, again, not every young person, not every trans person wants to go on hormones, so it's a ridiculous requirement.
Yeah. And I think about a couple of stories. When I was in high school, I wasn't really dealing with my gender identity issues at that time quite yet. But I was very isolated. And, the musical groups were my thing. And I can't, if I try to imagine, if they had said, well, you have to take a year off of, you can't be in band and choir for a year. Oh, well, great. Take my entire social structure away from me.
Right.
Are you kidding?
Bad enough you're making us go to the nurse's bathroom.
Yeah, but then when it comes to cross-sex hormones, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this argument made that trans women shouldn't be able to compete on women's teams, and like you mentioned, bone structure or body mass or muscle tone or whatever, because they're arguing that well, you were once male, so now you have an advantage, and I'll tell you.
Right.
Having been on estrogen, progesterone, and spironolactone for nearly 3 years, I am so much weaker than I have ever been.
She really is.
And thanks a lot for that.
I'm just testifying.
but whenever this comes up, and maybe you can help me with my argument here because I don't think it's it hasn't been very convincing. But whenever that comes up, I'm like, okay, well, what about trans men? You would be arguing that trans men would have to continue to compete with women. Isn't that an unfair advantage competing on the women's team? Oh, no, that's different. You're right. That's different. You would be stronger because of your hormone therapy and I just see the gears spin and nobody really knows what to do. So there's definitely some sexism mixed in with all of this problem. But I'm not sure that my argument has been very convincing. How do you, when you hear those arguments, how do you counter those?
Well, and yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, that's your argument is kind of the argument that folks use with the restrooms, right?
Yep.
We know that for these bathroom bills, for these restroom policing, that people don't want someone assigned male at birth in a men's restroom. That's really what it is, because trans men aren't even part of the conversation, really. And when it comes to seeing a picture of either me or a trans man with full facial, that doesn't deter, because they're not even thinking of that argument of saying a trans man shouldn't be in a women's restroom.
Yeah.
Right. No one's worried about me going into the men's room or the men's locker room.
Right.
So it's it's so much sexism and a lot of misogyny that comes into play when we're making these policies, both for access to these gendered spaces, for using the restroom or changing, and then as well as participating.
Yeah. So when we talk
there
about,
haven't been very.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for the sports, right? When we're talking about the sports, talking about your argument, there haven't been many studies about the impacts of study around trans women pertaining to marathon running, but we just don't have a lot of great information about this. These policies are changing and evolving over time, as we've seen with the NCAA policy, which was a pretty groundbreaking policy in terms of college students and athletes. And we've also seen it evolve at the international level with the IOC policy changing in 2015. And I think it's about to change again. These policies are constantly evolving based on what we understand to be the best medical and scientific information. But that said, there's just not a lot of research to go from. Here's the argument. Went through a male puberty, and so you have all that testosterone coursing through your muscles and in your body. For a trans woman, what people don't understand is exactly what you said as being weaker than you've ever been, is that testosterone is a performance enhancing substance, which is why I, as a trans man, get tested and need to get approval in order to use it and compete in sports. But also estrogen is a performance decreasing substance, right? And so, after 1 year of cross hormone therapy, a trans woman is on par with her cisgender peers.
Yep.
Where that 1 year in the international policy comes from, and that's the science behind, that being evident in policies. And as we mentioned before, that's not appropriate for high school and youth policies. But as people are looking at elite level policies or, national governing policies, that's the best information that they have to what they consider, level the playing field.
Right. So, so that kind of addresses, being allowed to play on the team. We often discuss news stories here on the show, where a young student is fighting a school district's restroom policy, and some try to do the separate but equal thing, which doesn't really properly address the problem, and some are inclusive, some are not. But a lot of school districts haven't even considered to a policy at all because they haven't encountered a trans kid. But that's restrooms. And while I don't seem to see these stories as often, I think people really get crazy when we start talking about locker rooms. And, that extends beyond organized sports into just like PE classes. What are you seeing out there as far as how schools are handling locker room policies?
What I'm seeing a lot of is, actually, I've talked to a lot of trans kids who have had good experiences, particularly in, those green states on the map on transathlete.com. There are many young high school transgender athletes who are competing right now. And part of that is that more coverage and more examples of trans people being able to participate in sports. And, these young people are seeing that they don't have to give up the sports that they love in order to be the person that they know that they truly are. So we have 2 transgender runners in the state of Connecticut who are in the same conference. They are competing against each other with women and, in the category which they belong. And it's great to see stories like that, examples like that, and that they're having great experiences in their schools because the schools do have those policies and that understanding of what they should do. But a lot of times when, we have these schools that say, oh, well, one, it's not required by federal law, so let's not do it until we have to. And then 2, we don't have any trans kids, so we don't need to do this right now. But a lot of those places might not have trans kids who are out because it's not safe or comfortable for them to be out. So it's really a cycle. When you do have that one strong trans kid who challenges a policy, we often see reactive policies being made, which are not in the best interest of the students.
Sure.
So those are the ones that are the case-by-case basis, or something for the school to protect themselves and say, oh yeah, we have something on the books, but it's definitely not a positive experience for the young people.
Yeah, I hadn't dealt with, again, I didn't deal with my gender identity until I was in my 30s, but I can certainly remember how anxiety-inducing it was to be naked with a room full of guys in the gym locker room during like PE class. And I don't know, I faked playing basketball for a year, and I was not athletic. I was musical. And I'm not a fan of this open floor shower locker room design at all. But when you look at a lot of these school districts, they're often really old buildings. I mean, my home high school was built in the late 1800s. So we could probably update some building codes, to say that any new construction that comes along would, or a remodel, they would have to address the design issues of, just everybody showering in a big open room. But that doesn't address anyone's needs right now either.
Yeah, and a lot of places are like that in that same situation, which makes me wonder what people were thinking when they built these buildings. But
yeah,
I think there are solutions, and there are definitely solutions. It's just sort of the same thing of gender neutral or single stall restrooms, right? That everybody likes privacy, and more and more in a world where we have none. Everybody likes to use the bathroom in private, and that's just a fact.
Yeah.
That we feel more comfortable using the restroom by ourselves. And so that seems like a no-brainer. It's not just trans people that benefit from having a single stall locking private restroom. And it's not just trans kids that benefit from having a locker room space with a private changing area. There are maybe students with skin conditions, or who have suffered abuse, or who have some sort of trauma, or any particular reason that they would like private changing area. It's not just something special for trans kids in high schools or trans adults at a YMCA, right? Yeah. And so I think that's really what it's about, is creating those spaces where everyone can feel comfortable. And it's good for families, it's good for people with attendance, it's good for everyone, right? And so looking at it from that bigger perspective, instead of just saying like, oh, we have to accommodate these trans people.
Yeah. We talked, it was last week on the show, I believe. We're starting to see some of that happen a lot sooner than I ever thought we would. Just recently, in the last couple of weeks, Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer announced that they were opening a new all-gender restroom at City Hall that is precisely that. It is floor-to-ceiling doors, stalls. Everything locks. And anyone can go in, and it helps for parents with children, caregivers of people with disabilities who need assistance in the restroom. And I think it's just absolutely wonderful that we're finally seeing. And once you get some of those established, and we have even more data to come back and go, oh look, nothing bad happens in one of these restrooms. I think that just moves the ball further down the court.
Ha ha ha.
Yeah,
I'm gonna get in as many sports puns as I can.
I love it. No, you're absolutely right. We need these positive examples, right? Because even in places that are, a little more liberal, and I would assume have the best intentions of their LGBTQ community in mind, we find that there's still resistance from folks of implementing things like this when really the risk factors seem so incredibly low, based on what we know to have happened in the past of, we're not going to attack anyone, right? And that bad things actually don't happen. But the perpetuation of these stereotypes and these myths and these fears have really driven people to create ridiculous policies, or to not implement what's best for everyone because of their assumptions or these fears.
Yeah. Now I know we're timed. Do you have a couple more minutes? I think I just have one more major question, and then we.
Yeah, I can go a little bit longer.
Okay, cool. So I think we've hit all the bases.
Pump.
So we've kind of covered, everything from K-12 to collegiate to professional sports, and I think we've done a good job of drawing out some arguments for gender affirming policies. For binary transgender athletes, where do non-binary and gender fluid folks fit into all of this? And you hear this a lot with the people who are just terrified at the idea that some kid in their school might wake up on a Monday and say I'm a girl, and then wake up on a Tuesday and say I'm a boy, and then wake up on a switch back and forth, and they're terrified of this for some crazy reason, which I just don't understand either, because if that's you, that's you. But again, like short of redesigning every school or stadium in America, what can we do to help non-binary athletes?
So for non-binary athletes, I think there is, if we had non-gendered facilities like the restrooms in Florida, right? That would be ideal, because we wouldn't be policing people's gender, and we wouldn't be worried about where people are going to do a basic human function, right? But that's not the case, and that's not what we have. I think within sports, because sport is so incredibly gendered, non-binary athletes have a super challenging time, because essentially they must pick their category of competition, and in most cases they need to maintain that for either the 4 years of high school, or they need to maintain that at least through an academic year of sports season, right? So playing volleyball, then basketball, then softball, all on the women's team, for example.
Yep.
But that's in progressive places. And so there are very few places that have that figured out and that have that sort of policy, whereas this is sort of where the case-by-case basis would come in. There is a little bit of problem with students changing competition categories, so being on the boys basketball team and then the girls volleyball team.
Right. And
that's where people are particularly challenged in their understanding and their acceptance of non-binary athletes. So I think this is, if we say that trans inclusion in sport is a 101 topic, which I would argue it's definitely not for most people. It seems like a junior level course.
Yep,
and,
definitely.
Non-binary is super advanced for most people who are just trying to figure out what cisgender means.
Right.
So I think the challenge remains that these folks really, I have a great example actually from yesterday. So yesterday I competed in the regional championship in duathlon, and I was in the transition area, which I always think is funny, but I picked a sport that has a transition area. So I'm setting up my bike and whatnot, and I noticed that there was someone who I read as non-binary, who was certainly not fitting within the standard categories of competition at one of these races where everyone is wearing spandex and has very, specific uniform styles. Yeah. And so as a trans person, my radar goes off when I'm in that space of like, I see tribe and I see community. And also, I got really nervous for this person because they were, I would say I read them as being in the middle, right, of the binary. And I know that's a very dangerous place in sport. Mm-hmm. And I overheard when I was setting up my bike, I saw this person was wearing a biking jersey, so a very tight sleeved jersey, and then a running skirt, which on a bike is typically not what an athlete would wear, but I say a bold style choice, and I loved it. It looked great.
Yeah.
But these two women next to me saw this athlete and started to make fun of them and to use pronouns that I assumed were probably the wrong pronouns, but maybe not. But they were just being really critical of what this person was wearing, and I called them out on it.
Good.
Right before the race, and I was really worked up about it because I said, did it ever occur to you that this person might be gender non-conforming, non-binary, or transgender? And they said, oh, yeah. And they used a pronoun and said that they are using a pronoun. And I said, well, do you know this person? Like, I can't believe that you would talk about someone like this before a race when this person is just here to compete and have fun.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really rude and childish for you to impose your judgments on them. And I think they were a little shook that I called them out on it, but I was really upset that was the response that this person was getting of just trying to participate and I assume find that community and feel like yourself. And I watched this person cross the finish line, and they were so pumped, and I mean just like fists up and just as happy as they may have ever been. And it was clearly a big moment for them at a championship race. And to think that the response from other people is that they just don't know what to do with us if we don't fit neatly into one of two boxes.
Yeah.
And so, until we have some sort of, and I would almost say until we had some sort of federal policy, which I will not hold my breath.
Yeah.
There's going to be so much misinformation about where non-binary athletes belong that this will be a fight that we fight for a very, very long time.
Yeah, that's frustrating as hell because, it wasn't that long ago, 2 years, when we had federal guidance, at least that said, look, here's what you should do with trans kids in schools, and then how quickly we lost that too. So absolutely vote. And that story,
Yes.
that was great, and that illustrated some components that I hadn't even thought of myself. I think of things like when I'm thinking of like my high school, right? You had the boys' sports and the girls' sports, and even if you had wanted co-ed teams for certain sports, like the odds of getting that done, I mean, that costs money. You gotta, coaches and all of that stuff that comes along with it. And in fact, like it's odd because I grew up in a really small town of 1,400 people. My high school graduating class was 32. We had lots of corn and soybeans. But we were one of the, football in the Midwest, man, that was like Friday Night Lights. Like in the 80s when when my sisters were in school, man, everybody in town was at the football game, whether it was a home or an away game. Everybody went, and it was a huge deal. Now, by the time my apathetic
Millennial generation.
Zennials got into high school, we didn't give a shit, and we wanted to listen to Green Day and smoke pot, and so they actually had to consolidate our school's sports with another school 7 miles down the road to play football together. We maintained our own other teams, basketball and stuff. And then not long after that, they had to consolidate our school with yet a different school, like for the purposes of schooling, because money mismanagement and taxes and all of that sort of thing. So it's weird now. We've got this hybrid school that also plays football with a completely different school. Like the interest in sports has just changed from when I was little in some areas. And I think, if you were to go back to that school today and say, okay, here's a trans or a non-binary kid, they wouldn't have the first damn clue.
No.
Yeah. And that's a great highlight of what national statistics are, in that we know that young lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer kids, trans was not part of this, but just LGBTQ kids are half as likely to participate in sports as their peers. And so we have that statistic already, coupled with the fact that school participation within sports has declined so greatly over the last 10 years for young people. Young kids are participating in team sports less. They're moving less.
Yeah.
They are less active and less healthy than they were 10, 20 years ago. And so that is a great example of just the national decline of participation in sports, paired with the fact that I think people are more invested in sports on TV than they have ever been. So it's a very interesting, we have these role models, we have these icons and heroes in professional sports, and kids are then maybe playing esports instead of going out in the driveway with a basketball.
Sure.
So
Yeah, I definitely see that.
Well, and the homeowners association won't let you put up a basketball net in your driveway anymore. So, you know.
Right. I was also just thinking, I don't know the last time I had a driveway, so
That's also
maybe
common,
part
yeah.
of it.
And it's too hot outside to do anything.
Oh
Let's
God!
just be honest.
Yeah, we're in Florida, and it's surface of the sun hot every given day. Our kid, we have an 8-year-old, and last year during second grade, they were the last. The PE was the last block of the day, and so during the hottest part of the afternoon, you have these 7-year-old kids out running around the track. Are you kidding me? Anyway,
Yeah.
And then you
digress.
wonder why kids don't like running around the track.
Yes,
Right? That's
yes.
miserable.
One of these days, we're gonna move out of Florida into some place that has legal weed and colder temperatures.
And socialized healthcare.
Yeah, right. Is that the Netherlands?
Yeah, probably
Okay.
something like that.
Okay, so tell us about transathlete.com. You have a lot of information and resources there. What all can people find there?
Yeah, so people can find policies across the board, from youth sports to collegiate and intramural recreation sports, as well as elite professional and international sports. I accept donations. These things that I have collected over time. And so if anybody has a rec league or a sports league that they're a part of and has a policy, I would love to put it on the site, and they can just contact me online at the Chris Mosier on any of the social media platforms, and I would love to take that policy. There's also recommendations for making a good policy, whether that's a youth sport model policy or help with creating policies for recreation sports, adult sports, or anything else. It's all there with many resources. So transathlete, like oneathlete.com.
Awesome. And your website was thechrismosier.com.
Yep, that's right. And the Chris Mosier on all of the social media.
Awesome. If people have, I don't know if you covered this. So if people, maybe there's somebody out there who needs guidance, right? Maybe they've got a trans kid who's trying to play in a sports team or a league or a school team. So they can get a lot of information there. Do you want people to be able to reach out to you directly to say, hey, can you help me with this? Or how does that work?
Yeah, there's contact information on transathlete.com and on my website for folks to get a hold of me. And also, I respond to everything through social media. So, DM me on Instagram or Facebook, chat on my public page. All of that is a good way to get a hold of me. And I talk to parents and teachers and young people every single day looking for advice or guidance, whether that's the wording for a letter from a doctor was a recent one that I just did, or just support of resources of like, what books should I read because I think the kid is gender nonconforming, right? So anything in between there, for if you have a gender expansive kid or you are gender expansive or trans, it's a case-by-case basis with my help. Let's do that.
There you go.
No, I help everybody, but the answers aren't always the same.
Right,
and that's the complicated part. It really depends on the play. And it also, sadly, depends on whether someone is, gender expansive, non-binary, or if they are a trans man or a trans woman, because my experience as a transgender man has been really different than the experience of any transgender woman that I've seen try to participate in sports, whether that's from, the media's reception of me to my ability to create change as a policymaker and an advocate. I have certainly inherited a lot of male privilege and white male privilege in my transition. And, it's been a benefit for me to be able to achieve change, but it also puts me in a position that I know is very, very different than any trans woman who wants just the ability to have access to sport.
Yeah. Okay, new plan. Let's have Chris back on to talk about privilege.
I was just thinking that get out of my head.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
I was about to say
it's a whole different episode.
That
Yes.
privilege is a whole, yeah.
Yeah. But what I love about what you're doing is that the trans male voice is not heard as often in
Right.
the community when we're talking about trans issues. There's some erasure that issues that happen, and I love that you're out and vocal and helping people, make change. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we fall still into these rigid ideas of what a man should be, what a woman should be, what we should look like, whether that's for cis women or through transition. And I think these expectations aren't helpful for any of us. When we do see representations of trans men in the media, it's, big muscles, full beard, and a really very specific way of covering trans men. And particularly in sport, there's not many of us. And so, I think the more voices that we have, the better. And also with the recognition that my voice is not the only voice. It's just a singular experience in my job, the platform of being a Team USA athlete, a Nike-sponsored athlete, having access to media is to lift up other voices. Like, we need to be talking about non-binary athletes. We need to be talking about fair inclusion of transgender women in sports. And if I can use my experience as a way to do that, and my platform as a way to do that, then I think it helps everyone.
Yep. Awesome. And I love that you're doing it. Chris, thanks again for coming on the show today. I really appreciate the conversation, and definitely let's make plans to come back for another. I think that would be great.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome.
A lot of fun.
Thank you, Chris. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Chris Mosier. Again, check out transathlete.com and thechrismosier.com. And we'll have all of that in the show notes as usual.
Good stuff.
Yeah, that was great. All right. That's going to do it again for episode 126. Again, this is a surprise 2-episode week. So I hope you enjoy the extra content. If you want to give us feedback on that, whether it's too much or you love having an extra Sarah Talk drop in your pod feeder, let us know. We wouldn't be able to do the show at all if not for our patrons, and certainly not 2 episodes in a week. You really do make this thing happen, and I just want to say thank you so much. Our top patrons, part-time patron Russell, OG co-host Mandy Imus, The Wayward Willis Podcast, and Andrea. Also, Josie, Harry, Stacy, Megan, AJ, I Never Saw That Podcast, Lamont, and Dan. Again, thank you all so much for your continued support. This is what allows us to do the show, again, as I said, and drop in these surprise episodes on you in the midweek from time to time. We want to thank Chris Mosier again for coming on the show. That was a really great interview. If you are a patron, stick around through the outro here for a couple minutes of bonus content from our conversation with Chris before we really got into the interview. If you're not a patron, you can become a patron at patreon.com/SarahTalk, or you can go to SarahTalk.com and click on the support link. And we'll see you Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Facebook Live show. You've been listening to Sarah Talk.
Sarah Talk is made possible by listener support. Visit patreon.com/SarahTalk to become a patron and help keep this program going. Contact Sarah and Company by email at producer@sarahtalk.com or call 224-40-SARAH. That's 224-407-2724. And follow us on social media, facebook.com/SarahTalkRadio, and on Twitter @SarahTalkRadio. The opinions and information provided on this show are intended for entertainment purposes only. All opinions are solely that of the hosts and their guests. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, timeliness, or validity of any information and will not be liable for any errors or damages. Sarah Talk is a production of Sarah Austin Media.